All right. So welcome everyone to the FireBase workshop. So welcome everyone to the FireBase workshop. Want to start with a little bit of going over what FireBase is. For if you're not familiar with it, it's a backend replacement. So rather than writing your own servers and code for your backend, you can use FireBase to kind of pre-build APIs and things like that. And yeah, it handles a lot of common features. The two most common that people use it for is authentication and their database. But it can also do generic backend functions if you need things with more privileged APIs or things like that. And there's some other features like machine learning that I'm not going to get into, but if you're interested in, talk to me. Another big one is it can host your website for you pretty easily, which is a lot easier than trying to figure that out, how to do that yourself. So why would you use FireBase? It's very easy to use. You're going to see we're going to have kind of a working app that syncs across multiple users in probably about 20 minutes. It scales really easily. So if you have 1,000 people, it should work pretty well with that without much issues. And it's free, at least if you don't have very many people. The pricing also scales. So as you get more people, one of the cons is that those costs can rack up. I don't know how it compares to other options. It probably depends on exactly what you're doing, but that's definitely something to consider. Also means if you're using FireBase, it's pretty unique, and you're probably not going to be able to use anything else without completely reworking your code, so you're kind of stuck. So do be careful. Consider what you want to do with that. But if you're just doing this for a hobby project, it's great. And you're also stuck in Google's homogeny of the internet. I don't know if you care about that, but it's also a factor. So yeah. As far as what you're going to do if you're setting up a new project for FireBase for the first time, you're going to set up a project in the console. I have two here. We'll be using this FireBase to-do one for the project today. And here's a link. I have a link to it here. If you just Google getting started with FireBase, that's what comes up. So you'll create your thing, and then you're going to add it to your client app. That client app can be a website, which is what we're doing today, but it could also be a mobile app, or any other type of client app you can think of, pretty much, but generally mobile and web. And how you do that depends on the language and things you're using, but we're going to, but we'll add that in. I've already done that for today. I'll show you where I did it, but we won't have to do that for our project. And then, yeah, you can start getting the meat of things. The first thing we're going to do is authentication, which is specifically accounts and users and making sure that the person who's doing something is who they're saying is who they say they are. So to get started, you need to enable it within FireBase. So again, you made that project, and on the FireBase console, which is a website, you go to the authentication section, and there'll be here a big button that says enable authentication. You click yes, and then you have to add a new provider. And then we're using the email and password provider. You can use pretty much anyone who supports OAuth, so Google, Facebook, etc. It's not really that much harder. It doesn't really add that much to set it up, so we're not going to do it today. We're just going to use email and password. But the principles will be the same, and I forgot to add a blank slide. So we are going to go ahead and show how this works with a demo. And if you really want to type that out, you can. I also sent it in the Slack in the Appathon channel. If anyone needs help getting to that, let me know. You can also just follow along as I'm doing it here. It's up to you. Why is that at? Okay, that's better. So just to point this out, this is the HTML for this on the side. If you haven't used CodePen before, we'll have all three, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Here, we won't be changing the CSS. But to start things off, I have this script, and this initializes the FireBase to our project. I'm importing from some FireBase CDN, so it's just pure JavaScript in this case. If you're using React or something else, there's libraries to integrate. And there's this config file that I copied from the console. So what are we going to do here? So we want to add, we have a little basic to-do app here. We can add things, you know, remove them, clear list, whatever. It's great, it works. It even stores locally. What it doesn't do is save to the cloud. So if I open this up on a different machine in a different, in a private window or something, it's not going to work. So just to demonstrate that real quick, and then I want to copy this and print it in. and there's nothing down here. So that's not great. So let's get this to work. First thing for that, though, is we're going to get synced by users, and we're going to need to add authentication. So I'm real quick going to add HTML we need for this authentication. Just a username and password box, just basic HTML inputs. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And the other thing we're going to do is down here, this is a normal text/JavaScript type. I'm going to change this to be a module, which is an ES6 JavaScript thing, and mainly that lets us import things from FireBase. Be a little careful if you're doing this in a production app because it doesn't translate well to older browsers. Hopefully most of us are using newer browsers, so that shouldn't be a problem today. There's tools to translate that to older code if you need it. All right, so that's all the HTML that changes, and we won't be changing anything for the rest of the night. So we're going to switch to JavaScript. We only have one JavaScript file. It's this, it's CodePen, so it's all in one place. And the first thing we're going to do is import a bunch of stuff from Firestore. So a bunch of auth functions, and we're going to create this nice auth object, which we'll use for any of these calls. It's just kind of Firestore's description, or sorry, Firebase's description of your authentication. And I'm quickly going to add some other elements. The main things I'm adding here is I'm getting this sign in button here and sign out button here. Yeah, as well as we're adding elements for the sign in container. So the div that contains all this, and the main container, which is the div that contains everything below here. I made a slight gap in the HTML here and have a duplicate. I'm going to add a global variable that's the sign-in user, and we're defining it to null at first because no one signed in. And this is where we get to the fun part. So I'm going to add a sign-in function. I accidentally called it on sign. So what's happening here? So if we go through this function, the first thing we do is get the email and the password, and that's just getting the values of these two text boxes. Then we call this sign in with email and password, which is one of these functions we imported up here. And we pass it that auth object, the email, and the password. And that returns a promise. So it's not going to run immediately. It's going to say, we'll run it at some point, and then we'll let you know when we're done. So then this function returns immediately afterwards. But we call this .then to say, so when it's done running, let's do something else. And what do? We get this user credential object, and we just set the sign-in user to user credential.user. Great. If it doesn't work, if something goes wrong, we do this .catch, and we get the error. And we're going to check if this error equals auth user not found. So that's what Firebase returns if the user isn't there, so someone's created the account. I'm going to do some really bad UX here and just create that user with the create user with email and password. Probably should not do this if you're making a real app, but for the sake of learning how things work, we're just going to do it because I didn't want to make another page. And if that fails, we're just going to log it. And if it's a different error, we're just going to log it. And then similarly, but much simplerly, we're going to have a sign out function. Paste that down here. And all the sign out function does is call sign out. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And then Firebase handles the rest from there. So let's hook that up. So at the bottom, we have some event listeners. I'm going to paste an event listener for the sign in button and the sign out button. Yes, because I had a bug in my initial code. Thank you. So that should work. So I should be able to work, We don't have any email verification, so I can put in any email. Again, something you should probably fix. They have tools for that, but the basic idea works. I'll sign in, and I believe it succeeded. I don't think we'll see any errors here. No. These are actually not, these errors work, I think. They're not errors related. So it works, but it doesn't do anything yet because we didn't make it do anything. So how are we going to make it do something? We could set up some sort of listener that tries to figure out every time this changes, but we don't actually change it like on sign out. So why not? Because Firebase provides this pretty useful function to call called on-off state changed. And so what that does is we give the auth object again, and then we give it a function that gets called every time our off state changes. So every time the user is changed, it will get called. So we set our sign in user object to be that user. So either it'll be null if no one signed in. Then we check. If it's not null, if it's some defined value, we're going to hide the sign in div and remove hidden, show the main div. Otherwise, we'll hide the main and show the sign in. So you can see the sign in disappeared because I just signed in. If I sign out, it switches. I don't have any explicit code in the sign out. The sign out button just calls sign out. It doesn't call any of this. So I could sign out in a different way. I could have another button, and this, I'd only need this one bit of code. So this is what a lot of these Firebase calls, you'll end up seeing these listeners rather than having explicit calls. And that lets you keep all of your code for handling a change in one place. And I think it has, the library has optimization so that it doesn't like go all the way to the server and back. It calls your local code locally before sending it to the server. So just to make sure we can sign back in, let's do that. Again, my fake email. And it works. So that's authentication. And honestly, that's about all that you need to know. Again, there's some nitty-gritty details you get into with how you want to structure that. They have a tool. They have a pre-built UI you can use for handling all of this. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with the newest Firebase. You can get it to work, but it's a bit of a pain. So it's up to you about whether you want the newer features or if it's better to deal with being able to build your own, not have to build your own authentication UI. Any questions on how any of that works? So all of these is what Firebase are included Firebase. So most Firebase, this is a JavaScript pattern, but definitely a Firebase pattern. You'll do something, so sign in, and then you'll pass a function to call after it happens. And so this function is obviously super simple. I'm doing almost nothing. This one's a little more complicated. I'm choosing, depending on what happens, I'm choosing to create a new user. And of course, this one does the most anytime it's changing. But yeah, so your user code generally lives in these functions that's responding to events. In the same way that a button click is also responding to an event, you just have more events now besides just buttons. Yeah.
So if you have a multi-page like web page and then you transition authentication down.
No. So I believe there's a get user Firebase function up here that I could have imported. You can call it from anywhere, and you can get the currently logged in user, which may be null. If no one's logged in, it will be null. You could also pass it around, but then if you pass it around, you have to keep it updated. So probably a better pattern would have been to use get user. Again, for a one-page website, I could use this little global variable. You could also define a singleton or something and keep it somewhere in a module that's imported by other modules. But yeah, I think they have a get user function, so you could get it from anywhere if you have a multi-page website.
And would that be linked to
Yeah, I honestly don't know how they implement it. Probably it's a cookie because that's generally how they do these things. And yeah. And then probably auto signs out and things. Firebase, this is why Firebase is good, is I don't really have to know how they implement this. A lot of the security features I don't have to worry about, like auto signing out. They'll do that eventually. It'll auto expire, I'm sure. I still have some I need to worry about. Like I should probably be confirming my emails. And they have a system to send confirmation emails if you want to do that. Again, if you want to know more about the details of some of the stuff, talk to me after. I can go over that as well. Yeah, no, it definitely is way easier. And again, like I did this, if you want to set up a sign up for Google, it's maybe one step harder that you have to redirect to Google's page, but pretty much that's it. You'll have to redirect, Firebase will handle it, and you'll come back and you'll be able to do on-off state change to see if they actually logged in or not. So it simplifies using multiple login providers as well. So, but we'll move on to Firestore here, which is Google's database. It's a NoSQL database, which means that it's storing things in forms of documents, which in particular, it's using basically JSON, which is JavaScript objects, essentially. If you're not familiar with JSON, it's pretty simple. I'll go over it when we get there. If you are, you'll pick it up real quick. But yeah, for setting it up, the main thing you're going to have to do is activate it. Again, go to this thing, and there'll be a big button over here that says activate. You click it, and then you're good. You will also have to set these rules. Usually when you're developing, you set them to a rule that says anyone can read and write anything in your database. It's obviously a terrible idea for production because anyone can read or write anything in your database. So for this app, I did a more specific rule that we have inside. The database is organized in paths. So we have this path here. So this is just all the documents in the database. And then for documents that match the path /app, which is our top level one, to-dos, so to-do objects. And then this is a variable because it has the curly braces around it. So UID, which is short for user ID. So a variable user ID, and then any document. So we will allow people to read, write, or create those if request.auth, so the authenticated user, is not null, so they're signed in, and the user ID for request.auth is equal to this UID variable. So this basically means people can create, write, read, or write documents that are inside a folder with their user ID. So we're going to use that to basically say you can only edit documents within your own part, and you can't change someone else's. So every user has their own to-dos, and they can only see and edit their own. Yeah, let's go implement that then. So yeah, as I said, right now this is storing these to-dos to local storage, which is great, cool. But I'd like it to sync. I don't know if any of you have this pulled up, but obviously when I changed this, it didn't. By the end of this, you should be able to have it pulled up on your computer and it sync automatically.
Have to sign in.
Yes, you have to sign in. And I've just been using password for any of the passwords I put in here. So if you ever want to sign in to whoever I'm signed in as, it was just password. Again, don't do that on your actual accounts. That would be really dumb. But there's nothing important stored here. So we're going to start very similarly to how we did it for authentication with an import. This is automatically updating for you when I save it. Is that working or not? Okay, yeah, the items shouldn't update. Good, the code is, yeah, we'll get to the items updating, but I'll take a minute. So again, we're doing some imports here. We'll get to what these do as we get to them. The first one, get Firestore, we're going to create this DB object, which is very similar to the auth object. It doesn't do anything other than be an argument to other functions. This style of writing functions is a functional style rather than object-oriented. If you've taken 524 with Jeff Terrell, you will know it.
Get Firestore is, what is it getting? The database, the whole database?
It's not getting, it's getting, you could imagine it as like a pointer to the database. These other functions like get docs, delete doc, they need to have access to what Firestore you're using, what database you're accessing. And so you're telling it that I'm going to use a Firestore for my signed in account. I assume for a more complicated project, you could have multiple FireBase projects connected. You're almost never going to do that, so I wouldn't worry about it. But you just kind of know this is something you have to give to every FireBase or Firestore call. And so that's why I just have it as a const at the top. It's not going to change. It's just there. And you'll see it used in a bit here. So let's start with loading our to-dos from the server. So we're going to make this load to-dos function. And we need this global variable up here, var current snapshot unsubscribed. Well, I'll explain what that does in a second. Why did you jump around? Okay. So what we're going to do in this function, we're going to see if this is not null, and if it's not null, we're going to call it. And why we do that, again, I'll get to in just a second. First thing we're going to do is get the user ID. Because remember, we're only letting users edit documents under the folder for their user ID. So we need to know what their user ID is. We set this signed in user variable earlier, so we know it's not null because you can't get to this unless you're signed in. Then we're going to get this collection. So what's a collection? In Firestore, a collection is a set of documents. Why aren't you loading properly? Normally it's not words everywhere. It's like logos, like that. All right, so we have app, this is a collection, and then we have a document of to-dos. And then inside to-dos is a bunch of collections. You probably guessed these are user IDs. And inside each set of user IDs is all of the tasks for a person. So this guy has a task named Bob. I don't know why. Well, I do actually, because I wrote it. I don't know why I did. So we're going to get a collection, which is a pointer to one of those collections. We're not going to get any of the data yet. Pass it that DB object, and then the path. So app/todos, and then the user ID. So again, app todos, and then I don't know what the user ID is. It's going to be one of these long strings. And then we're going to call this onSnapshot function, which will run the past function every time any document changes inside that collection. And this current snapshot unsubscribe is what's returned, and that will unsubscribe, so not run the function again. And that's why we call it. So basically, every time we listen to a new collection, like if we sign in and out, we want to remove the old listen. What are we doing? Every time it changes, we set the list, the HTML of the list to empty, and go through every document in our collection, get its data, and then create a list item. And then we add it to our goal. Does that make sense? All right, so let's get this to actually run. So this code here is what's setting it up right now. We're going to delete all of that because we don't need it. And we're going to do if signed in user. Because remember, we're only running this load to-dos if someone signed in. Now, that didn't do anything because we didn't have any items. We also need to remember to run it every time the signed in user changes, or else it's not going to have, it's going to have issues. So that should now load. It's not doing anything because we don't have any objects in there. So let's figure out how to add some. So we have this add to list function right here. And I'm going to replace that with a new function, or replace a similar function that's going to add to FireBase. We're going to make this function async, which basically means for promises we can use an await keyword rather than using a .then. Just makes things more linear and easier to understand. So we're going to create a new item, and this is a JSON object. Remember JSON? What is that going to do? It's up at the top. Yeah, here, it's just going to create an object with a key. So this is kind of like a map in Java, a key to a value. So content and status. We're just creating those. And where's the add to do? It's right. Add to list. Okay. We're going to create that new one, and we're going to set its content to the value of this thing. Then we're going to get our user ID again, and we're going to set doc, which is a Firestore function to set the value or the content of a document. So doc is getting the reference to the document, and remember, we're going to pass it a database and then a path. So our path will be app/todos, the user ID, and then the name of the to-do item. And we'll set its value to be this object that we just made. So if we say get groceries and press add to list, it works. And yeah, so that's set. We look in here. We should be able to find it in one of these. Here it is. Nope. May not have reloaded. Here it is. So this is the new user ID, and there's the get groceries. And if you were signed in as daniel@gmail.com, you would actually see this on your screen as well. I can demonstrate that actually. I'll do this at the end. Okay. So yeah, that gets it. We want to be able to remove it again. If I do this, if I remove it now and reload, it's not actually deleting it from FireBase. Is there a bug? I hope I didn't just undo my work. I did. That sucks. How come I pressed the save button and that didn't work? All right. Second. So unfortunately, it didn't save, even though I pressed save. And clear everything. So I'm gonna have to real quick update this all. I'm not going to reload again for obvious reasons. Until this we've already done as well. All right. All right, so we're back to where we were. So to delete things, it's pretty simple. We want to go to remove item. And same principle, we get this doc reference at the same path and press delete doc. Does that make sense? Any questions on how we've been editing things, the references, any of that? Cool. Then there's, so we can add and delete things. If we test, and we can't add and delete things. Why is it not working? Plan isn't working. Oh wait, that should be the same. All right. Oh, I don't have the imports. So again, importing stuff is important. Now I have to add define DB2.
Delete all of that.
Yeah, when I reloaded the page, it just undid everything I did today, which was kind of unfortunate. Don't really know why it did that. I didn't think these things were supposed to do that. What's going on here? No, that would do it too. There we go. So we can now delete things and it'll go away. So what else do we still need to do? We need to clear the whole list. So the way you clear a whole collection in FireBase is you essentially just go through the entire collection. So if we get the collection, as we did before, we do this get docs, which gets all of the documents, and then we just go through every document and call delete doc. So if we add multiple things, workshop, dinner, and if we clear list, they all go away. So the final thing we need to do is press the complete incomplete. And again, that's working locally, but if we go here and look at it, it's still marked incomplete, even though I marked it complete in the app. So how are we going to get to that? Well, we need to look at what it's doing. And that it's using this var change to comp function to set it complete. So we're going to use another FireBase function here. The first one is getting that document reference again, going to the directory, the UID, and its content. We're going to use update doc. So update doc, that's the value of a doc, but it doesn't erase everything. It only changes the specific keys you give it. So I only give it status, so content doesn't change. This will mark it complete. And this await means that we don't run anything after it until this has returned. So this makes sure we don't change the event listeners until the update has succeeded. So if I press complete and now go, it's complete. And we need to do a very similar function for change to incomplete. Let's put that in here. Same principle, going through getting the value of the content and the parent element. This is again just walking HTML and getting that document and updating it to be incomplete. We can do all of this. So that's basically their whole app here. If you want to see that it's really doing what I'm saying that it's doing, that it'll sync, we can go, this is FireBase hosting, which is fairly simple to set up. Happy to walk you through it at some point if you'd like. I'm not going to do it today in the workshop. But you can see here's our app. I'm already signed in, and it loaded someone else's work. But let's sign out and sign into daniel@gmail.com. And type in password. Any of you could sign in to this site. It's hosted there. It's the same code that I just have. And we see it's here. If I press complete over here and go over to the demo, see it marked incomplete. I could add an item, go to the App Lab, add to the list. And if I go over here, add to list. We didn't write any code to do that, if you remember right. We just wrote the code to get it. But because we have this on snapshot, this is going to run every time something changes, even if it changes on a different user's computer. So you imagine that's pretty useful. You could have multiple users changing the same code, and you wouldn't have to think about updating everything. Wait, you just did something to this? Did you update? Oh, try reloading now. I just saved it. Yeah, I hadn't saved the code, so. There it is. So that's the basics of Firestore. So yeah, just to briefly overview, functions is pretty helpful as well in Firebase. Again, don't have time to go over that at the moment. That's very helpful if you need to do admin actions that you don't want your users to have access to. They have storage for hosting larger things, hosting for hosting your website. So again, this is the app we just did, but hosted on Firebase. And they also have some machine learning tools, which is one of the things I haven't used. But yeah, thank you all for coming. That's what we have. And